Danny Carter stood in the morning light watching the empty sky. The transport ship should have arrived 3 hours ago. It was the fourth missed delivery this month. Around him, the other colonists of New Haven gathered in worried groups, talking in hushed voices about food shortages and broken promises from Earth. Danny said nothing. He never said much these days. 3 years ago, the Zephyrian Empire had started their war against humanity. It wasn't like the wars in old movies with big explosions and dramatic battles. The aliens were smarter than that. They didn't blow up planets or kill millions of people at once. Instead, they squeezed slowly, like a snake around its prey. First, they cut off the supply lines between worlds. Ships that used to carry food, medicine, and equipment simply stopped coming. Then they jammed communication signals, making it hard for human colonies to talk to each other. Finally, they picked off isolated settlements one by one, always choosing the weakest targets. The worst part was how they did it. The Zephyrians would arrive at a human world, destroy just enough to make life difficult, then leave. They wanted humans to suffer, to lose hope, to give up without a real fight. It was working. Danny walked back to the fusion reactor building where he worked. The big machine hummed quietly, providing power to the entire colony. Most people avoided the reactor building. They found the complex machinery scary or boring. Danny found it peaceful. He had been a software engineer back on Earth before coming to New Haven 5 years ago. The colony needed someone who understood both computers and machines, and Danny needed a quiet place to think. The reactor was perfect for both needs. Inside his small workshop, Danny opened his notebook. Not a computer file or digital record, just an old paper notebook with a pen. He wrote down the time the transport was supposed to arrive, the time it actually didn't arrive, and notes about what the colony radio had picked up from space. For 3 years, Danny had been writing everything down. Every missed ship, every strange signal, every pattern he noticed. Other people talked about the war and worried about supplies. Danny just watched and wrote. The door to his workshop opened. Lisa Brooks, one of the colony administrators, stuck her head inside. "Danny, we're having a meeting about the food situation. We could use your input." Danny looked up from his notebook. Lisa was a good person who worked hard to keep everyone fed and safe. She deserved better than the impossible situation they were all in. "I'll keep the power running," Danny said quietly. "That's what I do." Lisa nodded and left. She knew better than to push. Danny Carter was helpful when you needed the reactor fixed or the computers working, but he wasn't much for meetings or planning sessions. After she left, Danny returned to his notebook. He flipped through pages of careful observations. Ship arrival times, communication blackouts, Zephyrian attack patterns. To most people, it would look like random numbers and dates. To Danny, it was starting to look like something else. Across human space, Admiral Kate Morrison was fighting a different kind of battle. In her command center aboard the battleship Constitution, she studied reports from dozens of worlds. Each report told the same story. Humanity was losing. Not losing battles exactly. Human forces could still fight well when they found the enemy. The problem was finding them. The Zephyrians seemed to know exactly where human ships would be and exactly where they wouldn't be. They attacked empty colonies and avoided defended ones. They hit supply convoys but ignored military patrols. "Admiral," said Captain Amanda Price, her chief aide, "we've lost contact with 3 more worlds in the Kepler sector." Morrison nodded grimly. 3 more worlds cut off from help. 3 more human communities left to slowly starve or surrender. "Any pattern to the attacks?" Morrison asked. "Intelligence thinks they're targeting worlds with the lowest morale scores," Price replied. Places where people are already scared and desperate. Morrison frowned. Intelligence had been saying that for months, but it didn't feel right. The Zephyrians were too precise, too efficient. It was like they had a playbook for breaking human spirits. Back on New Haven, Danny finished his daily maintenance check. The reactor was running smoothly, just like always. He walked outside and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Admiral Morrison was trying to save humanity with battleships and brave soldiers. Danny understood why that was necessary, but he wondered if it was enough. The Zephyrians weren't trying to conquer human space the usual way. They were trying to break human will to fight. That meant they had studied humans carefully. They knew how humans thought, how they reacted to fear and pressure. Danny opened his notebook again and stared at 3 years of careful observations. The missed ships, the communication blackouts, the attacks on other worlds, none of it was random. There was a pattern hidden in the chaos. Most people saw the Zephyrian War as unstoppable force meeting human resistance. Danny was starting to see it differently. The aliens weren't responding to human actions. They were following a plan, a very precise plan that accounted for exactly how humans would react to each move. That evening, Danny sat in his small apartment and made himself a simple dinner. Through his window, he could see other colonists gathered around small fires, sharing food and trying to keep their spirits up. They were good people doing their best in a terrible situation. Tomorrow, Danny would go back to his workshop and write down more observations. He would keep the reactor running and the colony powered. He would say little and watch everything. But tonight, for the first time in months, Danny Carter allowed himself to think about something more than just keeping quiet and staying alive. Tonight, he wondered what would happen if someone tried to break the Zephyrian plan instead of just reacting to it. The idea was probably crazy. Danny was just one person on one small world, far from the centers of power and military might. But as he fell asleep, Danny found himself thinking about patterns and predictions, about systems and the people who built them. Every system had weaknesses. Every plan had assumptions. And sometimes, one person who really paid attention could find the cracks that everyone else missed. Outside, the stars shined down on New Haven. Somewhere among them, the Zephyrian Empire continued its slow, methodical destruction of human hope. But in a small apartment next to a fusion reactor, a quiet man with a notebook was beginning to think about fighting back. 2 weeks later, the news reached New Haven. 3 more colonies had gone silent in the past month. Riverside Station, New Dublin, and Carson's World, all cut off from the rest of humanity. The colonists gathered around the community radio, listening to the crackling reports with growing fear. Danny stood at the back of the crowd, notebook in hand. While others whispered about the latest disasters, he wrote down dates and locations. Each lost colony fit perfectly into the pattern he had been tracking. Admiral Morrison was losing the war, and she knew it. Her forces won small victories here and there, but the Zephyrians always seemed to be one step ahead. When human ships moved to defend a system, the aliens attacked somewhere else. When supply convoys took new routes, the enemy was already waiting. "It's like they can read our minds," complained Colonel Ben Tucker during a strategy meeting. His Marines had fought bravely at Kepler Station, but brave fighting meant nothing when you were always in the wrong place. Morrison studied the star charts on her command table. Red marks showed lost colonies. Blue marks showed current human positions. The pattern was clear. Humanity was being pushed back toward Earth, slowly but steadily. "They're not reading our minds," Morrison said quietly. They're predicting our behavior. Somehow they know exactly how we'll respond to each attack. Back on New Haven, life was getting harder. The colony had enough food for maybe 6 more weeks. The medical supplies were running low. Worst of all, people were starting to lose hope. Lisa, Brooks organized rationing committees and work groups to keep everyone busy. Tony Martinez, the colony's former security chief, started training civilians for basic defense. Both of them were good leaders doing important work. Danny kept running the reactor and filling his notebooks. Every evening he sat in his workshop and studied the numbers. Attack patterns, timing, target selection, it all followed rules. The Zephyrians weren't improvising their war strategy. They were following something much more precise. Danny had seen this kind of pattern before, back when he wrote software on Earth. It looked like an algorithm, a set of mathematical rules designed to produce specific results. The aliens had apparently created a computer program for breaking human morale, and they were following it step by step. The realization should have been terrifying. Instead, Danny found it oddly comforting. Algorithms could be understood, computer programs had logic, and every system built by thinking beings had weaknesses. A month after the latest colony losses, a supply ship finally reached New Haven. Captain Jake Sullivan was an old-timer who had been running cargo between worlds for 20 years. His ship was small and fast, built for avoiding trouble rather than fighting it. Danny met Sullivan at the landing pad while the crew unloaded emergency supplies. The captain looked tired and stressed, like everyone involved in the war effort. "Captain Sullivan," Danny said quietly. "Could I speak with you privately?" Sullivan looked surprised. Most colonists either thanked him enthusiastically or complained about late deliveries. They didn't ask for private conversations. They walked to Danny's workshop, where Sullivan looked around at the neat rows of equipment and the stacks of handwritten notebooks. "What can I do for you, Mr. Carter?" Danny opened his newest notebook and showed Sullivan pages covered with dates, numbers, and carefully drawn diagrams. "The Zephyrian attacks follow a mathematical pattern," Danny said. "They're not making strategic decisions based on current conditions. They're following a pre-programmed sequence designed to maximize psychological damage to human populations." Sullivan stared at the notebook pages. The numbers and diagrams meant nothing to him, but something about Danny's quiet certainty was compelling. "You're saying they're following a script?" "More like a computer program. They've studied human behavior and created an algorithm that predicts how we'll respond to specific types of pressure. Every attack is calculated to push us closer to surrender." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Like most spaceship captains, he had seen enough of the war to know that something wasn't right about Zephyrian tactics. They were too precise, too efficient. "Let's say you're right," Sullivan said finally. "What can anyone do about it?" Danny closed the notebook and looked directly at the captain. "I need access to a quantum communication array, something powerful enough to reach military command channels. That's classified military equipment. I can't just—" "I'm not asking you to steal anything," Danny interrupted. "Just pass my analysis to someone in military intelligence, someone who might understand what I'm seeing." Sullivan studied Danny's face. The quiet engineer didn't look crazy or desperate. He looked like someone who had figured out an important puzzle and needed help sharing the solution. "I'll see what I can do," Sullivan said. "But don't expect miracles. The military has bigger problems than theoretical analysis." From civilian engineers, after Sullivan left, Danny returned to his notebooks. If he was right about the Zephyrian algorithm, then the war was being lost not because humans were weaker or less advanced, but because they were predictable. The aliens had turned human psychology into mathematics, but mathematics could be manipulated. Algorithms could be fed false data. Computer programs could be confused by unexpected inputs. For the first time since the war started, Danny Carter began to smile. 2 weeks later, Captain Amanda Price received an unusual message through military intelligence channels. A spaceship. Captain had forwarded some kind of analysis from a colony engineer claiming the Zephyrians were using psychological warfare algorithms. Price almost deleted the message without reading it. Military intelligence received hundreds of theories and suggestions from civilians every day, most of them useless. But something about the careful mathematical analysis caught her attention. She forwarded the message to the Admiral with a note. "This might be worth a look. The pattern analysis is surprisingly sophisticated." Admiral Morrison read Danny's analysis 3 times before calling Price into her office. "What do you make of this?" "It's either brilliant or completely crazy," Price replied. "But the mathematical work is solid. If this Carter fellow is right, we've been fighting the wrong kind of war." Morrison looked at the star charts again, seeing them with new eyes. If the Zephyrians were following a predictive algorithm, then every human defeat had been planned in advance. Every retreat, every loss of morale, every strategic mistake, all calculated to push humanity toward surrender. "Get me a secure communication line to New Haven," Morrison ordered. "I want to talk to this engineer." Back in his workshop, Danny heard the communication request through the colony's emergency radio system. Admiral Morrison herself wanted to speak with him. Other colonists were amazed that their quiet maintenance engineer had somehow attracted the attention of humanity's military commander. Danny just nodded and prepared for the most important conversation of his life. He had spent 3 years watching patterns and taking notes. Now it was time to see if anyone would listen to what he had learned. The war was about to change, though no one knew it yet. Not Admiral Morrison with her powerful fleet, not the Zephyrians, with their perfect algorithm, and not the colonists of New Haven who thought Danny Carter was just the guy who kept the lights on. Only Danny knew that the real battle was just beginning. The quantum communication took 3 days to establish. When Admiral Morrison's voice finally came through the crackling speakers in Danny's workshop, it sounded tired but determined. "Mr. Carter, I've read your analysis. My staff thinks you might be on to something. Can you explain it in simple terms?" Danny looked at his notebooks spread across the workbench. 3 years of careful observation, reduced to a single conversation that might change everything. "The Zephyrians aren't fighting a war," he said quietly. "They're running a program. Every attack follows mathematical rules designed to maximize human despair while minimizing their own losses. You're saying they've turned warfare into a computer algorithm?" "Exactly. They studied human psychology and created a predictive model. When they attack Colony A in a specific way, they know humans will respond by moving ships to defend Colony B. Then they attack Colony C while our forces are out of position." Morrison was quiet for a moment. In the background, Danny could hear the sounds of a military command center. People talking, computers beeping, the constant activity of a war effort. "Our intelligence estimates they're about 89% accurate in predicting our responses," Morrison said finally. "If you're right, that's not intelligence gathering, that's mathematical certainty." "Yes, ma'am, and their accuracy is increasing. The longer the war continues, the more data they collect about human behavior patterns." Danny heard Admiral Morrison talking to someone else, probably her staff. When she came back on the line, her voice was more focused. "Mr. Carter, you need to disrupt this algorithm?" Danny had been hoping she would ask that question. limited access to military communication networks. Not to command classified information, just to introduce small variables into the data stream the Zephyrians intercept. That's a significant security risk. Yes, ma'am, but the alternative is losing the war according to their mathematical schedule. The communication ended with Morrison promising to consider his request. Danny returned to his maintenance duties, but his mind was racing. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he might be able to do something more than just watch humanity lose across the galaxy. The Zephyrian Empire was celebrating another successful phase of their campaign. War Master Zenthara stood before a massive display showing human-controlled space. Red zones marked areas where human morale had dropped below acceptable resistance levels. Blue zones showed regions still capable of organized defense. The algorithm predicts complete human collapse within 18 months, reported Science Prime Veltar. Their psychological profile indicates they will seek negotiated surrender once morale drops below 30% in core systems. Zenthara was pleased. The Empire had avoided a costly direct military campaign by using human nature against itself. Humans were emotional creatures who responded predictably to fear and loss. The mathematical model had proven remarkably accurate. Continue. The current phase, Zenthara ordered. Target the agricultural worlds next. Food shortages will accelerate the demoralization process. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Ryan Foster was fighting for his life at Kepler Station. The Zephyrian attack had come without warning, just as the algorithm predicted. Human forces had been positioned to defend the wrong locations, leaving Kepler vulnerable. Foster's Marine unit was outnumbered 3-1, but they fought with desperate courage. They held the station's reactor complex for 6 hours before being forced to evacuate. As his transport lifted off, Foster watched Kepler Station burn behind them. It was another perfectly executed Zephyrian victory, another data point proving their algorithm worked exactly as designed. Back on New Haven, Danny received Admiral Morrison's response. He would be granted limited access to military communication networks, but under strict supervision. Captain Amanda Price would monitor his activities personally. "This is highly irregular," Price told him during their first conversation. "You're a civilian engineer with no military training. If you compromise our communications—" "I understand the risks," Danny replied, "but I've been studying their system for 3 years. I know how it works." Price wasn't entirely convinced, but Admiral Morrison had personally authorized the arrangement. Danny Carter would get his chance to test his theory. Danny's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to block Zephyrian intelligence gathering, he would feed their algorithm false information. Small changes to supply requests, minor adjustments to fleet movement reports, tiny variables introduced into the steady stream of data the aliens intercepted. Each change was carefully calculated. Danny had studied the algorithm long enough to understand its assumptions about human behavior. If he could make human actions appear slightly more random, slightly less predictable, the algorithm's accuracy would start to decline. The first test came 2 weeks later. Intelligence reports indicated the Zephyrians were planning an attack on the Meridian system. According to their algorithm, human forces would respond by reinforcing the outer defense platforms. Instead, Danny introduced false communications suggesting the platforms were already heavily defended. The Zephyrians adjusted their attack plan, targeting what they believed were lightly defended supply depots. When they arrived, they found those depots protected by the ships that were supposed to be defending the platforms. It was a small victory, but it proved Danny's theory. The algorithm could be fooled. Colonel Ben Tucker led the defense of Meridian, and was amazed by their success. For once, human forces had been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. His after-action report praised the improved intelligence coordination that had made the victory possible. Tucker didn't know that the improved intelligence was actually one quiet engineer introducing carefully planned chaos into alien calculations. Over the following months, Danny expanded his campaign. He created phantom supply convoys that existed only in intercepted communications. He generated false reports about human fleet movements. Most importantly, he began introducing random elements into what had been predictable human responses. The effect was subtle at first. Zephyrian attacks succeeded slightly less often. Their timing was occasionally off by a few hours or days. Small failures that individually meant little but collectively began to add up. Science Prime Veltar noticed the declining efficiency ratings but initially attributed them to human desperation, making resistance more unpredictable. That was actually what Danny wanted the Zephyrians to think. Admiral Morrison's forces began achieving surprising victories against enemies that seemed oddly unprepared. Commander Sarah Blake's squadron intercepted a Zephyrian supply convoy that should have been heavily escorted. General Pete Rogers successfully defended a system the aliens should have known was strongly fortified. None of them knew they were benefiting from Danny Carter's invisible war against an alien computer program. In his workshop on New Haven, Danny worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot next to his computers. Dr. Mia Chen, the colony's doctor, began checking on him regularly. She was concerned about his health, but respected his need for privacy. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she told him during one of her visits. "The war won't wait for me to get enough sleep," Danny replied quietly. "What war?" "You fix reactors and maintain computers." Danny looked at her thoughtfully. Mia was a good person and a skilled doctor. She deserved to know that someone was fighting back, even if she couldn't know the details. "Sometimes the most important battles are fought with notebooks and calculators," he said. "Sometimes one person paying attention can make a difference." Mia didn't understand what he meant, but she could see the determination in his eyes. Whatever Danny Carter was doing in his workshop, it was more than just maintenance work. Across human space, the tide of war was beginning to turn in ways no one fully understood. The Zephyrian algorithm, which had seemed mathematically perfect, was producing increasingly unreliable results. Human resistance was stiffening unpredictably, and in a small workshop on New Haven, a quiet engineer continued his patient work of turning alien certainty into confusion, one carefully placed variable at a time. 6 months into Danny's invisible campaign, the changes were becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as minor statistical variations in Zephyrian attack efficiency was now a clear downward trend. Admiral Morrison's weekly briefings showed human forces achieving tactical victories that should have been impossible. Danny sat in his workshop, surrounded by 6 notebooks filled with calculations. Each page represented hours of careful analysis, studying intercepted Zephyrian communications and identifying exactly where to introduce controlled chaos into their data stream. Captain Amanda Price contacted him every few days to review his activities. She had started as a skeptical monitor but was becoming a true believer as the results accumulated. "The Admiral wants to know if you can expand your operations," Price told him during their latest conversation. "Whatever you're doing is working." "I can't scale it up," Danny replied. "The beauty of this approach is that it looks random. If I introduce too many variables too quickly, they'll realize someone is manipulating their data." "So you're fighting a war of patience?" "I'm fighting a war of mathematics," Every algorithm has limits. I'm finding theirs. What Danny didn't tell Price was how exhausting the work had become. Each fake communication had to be precisely crafted to look authentic while containing exactly the right amount of misleading information. Too obvious, and the Zephyrians would spot the deception. Too subtle, and it wouldn't affect their calculations. He was creating ghost fleets that existed only in communication intercepts. Phantom supply runs that would make alien planners position their forces in the wrong locations. False intelligence reports that would cause them to overcommit resources to defending empty space. The key was understanding how the Zephyrian algorithm processed information. Danny had figured out that it weighted recent data more heavily than historical patterns. By feeding it carefully crafted false recent data, he could gradually shift their predictions away from accuracy. War Master Zenthara was growing concerned. The latest efficiency reports showed their attack success rate had dropped from 89% to 73%. Worse, the decline seemed to be accelerating. Science Prime Veltar explained these numbers, Zenthara demanded during their weekly strategy meeting. Human behavior patterns are becoming increasingly erratic, Veltar replied, studying data displays that showed growing unpredictability in human responses. Our psychological profile suggests they should be approaching complete demoralization, but instead, they appear to be entering a phase of desperate randomness. Randomness can be factored into mathematical models. Yes, War Master, but only if the randomness follows statistical rules. Human actions are becoming genuinely chaotic in ways our algorithm cannot predict. Zenthara studied the star charts showing current battle zones. Red markers indicated successful Zephyrian operations. Blue markers showed unexpected human resistance or outright defeats. There were far too many blue markers. Recalibrate the algorithm. Increase the randomness variables. We have already done so 3 times. Each recalibration produces temporary improvement followed by renewed degradation of accuracy. For the first time since the war began, Zenthara felt something resembling doubt. The psychological warfare campaign had been designed by the Empire's best minds and most advanced computers. It should have been mathematically perfect. Meanwhile, heroes across human space were achieving impossible victories without knowing why. Colonel Ben Tucker's Marines successfully defended 3 separate systems that intelligence said should have fallen. Commander Sarah Blake's small fleet repeatedly intercepted enemy forces that seemed unprepared for battle. General Pete Rogers led a counterattack that caught an entire Zephyrian battle group completely off guard. His after-action report noted that enemy forces had been positioned as if expecting human ships to be somewhere completely different. None of them knew that their success was being carefully orchestrated by a quiet engineer who never left his workshop. Danny's work was taking a toll on his health. He was living on 4 hours of sleep per night and eating nothing but ration bars. His hands shook slightly when he wrote, and Dr. Mia Chen was becoming increasingly worried about him. "You need to take better care of yourself," she told him during one of her visits. "Whatever you're working on isn't worth destroying your health." "It's worth more than you know," Danny replied quietly. Mia looked around the workshop at the scattered notebooks and the banks of communication equipment Danny had somehow acquired. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she could see it was important to him. "At least let me bring you some real food, and you need to sleep more than 4 hours." Danny smiled at her concern. It was the first time he had smiled in months. "I'll try to do better. This work is just time-sensitive. Everything seems time-sensitive during a war. But if you collapse from exhaustion, you won't be able to help anyone." After Mia left, Danny returned to his calculations. She was right about his health, but she didn't understand the stakes. Every day he delayed his work meant more human defeats, more colonies lost, more people surrendering to despair. The Zephyrian algorithm was designed to crush human morale on a precise schedule. Danny was disrupting that schedule, buying time for human forces to adapt and fight back. But the disruption had to be subtle and consistent. One mistake, one obvious manipulation, and the aliens would realize what was happening. Danny created a new series of false communications suggesting that human forces were developing some kind of new tactical doctrine. Nothing specific, just hints and implications that would make the Zephyrians think human unpredictability was the result of military innovation rather than information warfare. The deception worked. Science Prime Veltar reported to War Master Zinthara that human forces appeared to be implementing new strategic approaches that their algorithm couldn't account for. What kind of tactical innovations? Zinthara asked. Unknown. Their communication patterns suggest coordinated changes in fleet deployment and defensive positioning, but we cannot determine the underlying principles. Then we adapt our approach. Increase direct military pressure. If we cannot predict their movements, we will overwhelm them with superior force. This was exactly what Danny had been hoping for. By making the Zephyrians doubt their algorithm, he was forcing them to abandon their most effective weapon, the mathematical certainty that had let them manipulate human psychology with surgical precision. Admiral Morrison noticed the change in enemy tactics immediately. Zephyrian attacks were becoming more direct and less psychologically calculated. They were still dangerous, but they no longer carried the devastating morale impact that had been crippling human resistance. They're fighting more like a conventional military force, she told her staff during a strategy meeting. Less precision, more brute force. That works in our favor, said Captain Price. We can fight a conventional war. It's the psychological manipulation that was killing us. Morrison nodded, but she wondered what had caused the change. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was having trouble with their tactical predictions, but no one could explain why. Only one person knew the real reason, and he was too busy working to celebrate. In his workshop on New Haven, Danny Carter continued his patient campaign against an alien computer program, fighting the most important battle of the war with nothing but notebooks, calculators, and an understanding of how thinking machines could be made to think differently. The Zephyrian Empire's perfect algorithm was slowly becoming perfectly wrong, and Danny was the only human who knew why. The cascade effect started small, like most important changes in complex systems. A Zephyrian supply convoy arrived 3 days late to support an attack because Danny had introduced false scheduling data into their intelligence stream. A battle fleet found itself facing prepared human defenses instead of the scattered refugees they expected. Each small failure created larger problems. Late supplies meant delayed attacks. Wrong intelligence meant failed operations. Failed operations meant the algorithm had to be recalibrated again and again. Danny watched the cascade develop from his workshop, tracking each ripple effect through intercepted communications and battle reports. He had spent 8 months learning to think like their machines, and now he was teaching their machines to think incorrectly. The beauty of his approach was that it looked completely natural. From the Zephyrian perspective, human behavior was simply becoming more unpredictable as the war progressed. They had no reason to suspect that one person was systematically manipulating their data. Science Prime Veltar stood before War Master Zenthara, holding reports that made no mathematical sense. Their psychological warfare algorithm, which had been 94% accurate when the war began, was now performing worse than random chance. The humans appear to be developing resistance to psychological manipulation, Veltar reported. Their responses to stress and defeat are becoming increasingly irrational. Irrational how? They should be surrendering. According to every model we have developed, human morale should have collapsed months ago. Instead, they seem to be fighting more effectively despite suffering continued losses. Zenthera studied the battle reports spread across the command table. Too many operations ending in failure or marginal success. Too many human forces appearing in unexpected locations. Too many tactical surprises from a species that should have been predictable. Perhaps our understanding of human psychology was incomplete. That seems unlikely, War Master. We studied their species for decades before beginning operations. The mathematical models were extensively tested and verified. But the models were failing, and Zenthara knew it. The carefully orchestrated campaign to break human will was producing the opposite result. Instead of becoming demoralized, human forces seemed to be gaining confidence with each unexpected victory. Admiral Morrison was experiencing the same phenomenon from the opposite perspective. Her forces were achieving tactical successes that should have been impossible given their strategic disadvantages. It's like the enemy keeps making basic mistakes, reported General Pete Rogers during a staff meeting. They position forces to counter moves we never made. They arrive late to battles they should have won easily. Their intelligence network must be compromised, suggested Colonel Ben Tucker. Maybe we've finally disrupted their information gathering, Morrison. Wasn't convinced it was that simple. The pattern of Zephyrian mistakes was too consistent, too systematic. It felt less like disrupted intelligence and more like the enemy was working from fundamentally wrong assumptions about human behavior. Captain Amanda Price had a different theory, one she shared only with the Admiral. What if it's not about disrupted intelligence? What if someone is actively feeding them false information? That would require access to their communication networks. We don't have that capability. We don't. But we do have someone who's been studying their patterns for years. Someone who specifically requested access to our military communications. Morrison looked at Price thoughtfully. The engineer on New Haven. Danny Carter. What if he's not? Just analyzing their algorithm? What if he's actively manipulating it? The idea seemed too fantastic to believe. One civilian engineer conducting information warfare against an advanced alien empire. But the results spoke for themselves. Ever since Carter had gained access to military networks, Zephyrian tactical efficiency had been declining. Back on New Haven, Danny was fighting exhaustion and an increasingly complex information war. Each false communication he created had to account for dozens of variables. The timing had to be perfect. The content had to be believable. The strategic implications had to create exactly the right amount of confusion without triggering suspicion. Dr. Mia-Chen found him asleep at his workbench one morning, surrounded by notebooks covered in calculations. She gently woke him and insisted he eat a real meal. "You're going to collapse if you keep this up," she said, setting a plate of food in front of him. "I'm close to something important," Danny replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "The pattern is breaking, down faster than I expected." "What pattern?" Danny looked at her thoughtfully. Mia had been taking care of him for months, without asking too many questions. She deserved some kind of explanation. The aliens think they understand human psychology. They've built their whole war strategy around mathematical predictions of how we'll behave, but mathematics only works if the initial assumptions are correct. And you're proving their assumptions wrong? I'm making their assumptions wrong. There's a difference. Mia didn't fully understand what he meant, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Whatever Danny was doing, it was consuming every bit of his energy and focus. Just promise me you'll get some real sleep tonight. Whatever you're working on won't matter if you collapse from exhaustion. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Danny slept for 8 hours. When he woke up, he found that the war had continued without his constant attention. Zephyrian forces had launched a major offensive against 3 human systems and achieved mixed results at best. The offensive should have been a coordinated triumph, but the algorithm had positioned forces based on false intelligence Danny had, planted weeks earlier. Half the attack groups arrived at heavily defended positions, while the other half found empty space where human fleets were supposed to be. It was the clearest sign yet that the Cascade failure was accelerating. The Zephyrian Empire's perfect system was becoming perfectly unreliable. War Master Zenthara called an emergency session with the Empire's top strategists. The offensive that should have broken human resistance in 3 key systems had instead resulted in significant Zephyrian losses. How did human forces know our attack vectors? Zenthara demanded. They should not have known, replied Fleet Commander Koran. Our communications were secured. Our movements were coordinated according to the algorithm's predictions. Then, the algorithm is wrong. Science Prime Veltar looked uncomfortable. The algorithm cannot be wrong, War Master. It is based on fundamental principles of human psychology, verified through extensive observation. Then explain why we are losing battles we should easily win. For the first time since the war began, Veltar had no answer. The mathematical models that had made the Zephyrian Empire confident of victory were producing results that contradicted all known principles of warfare and psychology. Back in his workshop, Danny smiled as he read the battle reports. The Cascade was reaching the point where the Zephyrian algorithm was not just inaccurate but actively counterproductive. Every decision it made was based on assumptions about human behavior that Danny had systematically corrupted. But he knew the most dangerous phase was approaching. Soon, the aliens would realize their system had been compromised. When that happened, they would either fix the algorithm or abandon it entirely in favor of direct military action. Danny preferred the second option. Humans could fight a conventional war. What they couldn't fight was an enemy that could predict their every move with mathematical precision. He opened a new notebook and began planning the final phase of his campaign, not just to confuse the alien algorithm, but to convince them it could never be trusted again. The quiet revolution Danny had started in his workshop was about to become a very loud victory, though he had no intention of taking credit for it. In a war fought with battleships and brave soldiers, the most decisive battles were still being fought with notebooks and calculators by one tired engineer who understood that sometimes the best way to win was to make the enemy defeat themselves. The Zephyrian Empire's response to their failing algorithm was exactly what Danny had hoped for. They decided to commit everything to one massive offensive. If mathematics could no longer guarantee victory, they would achieve it through overwhelming force. War Master Zenthara stood before the Empire's War Council, announcing the mobilization of every available ship and soldier. The reserve fleets that had been held back for decades would finally enter the war. The human resistance has proven more unpredictable than our model suggested, Zenthara declared. We will compensate with superior numbers and firepower. This offensive will break their will permanently. Science Prime Veltar had recalibrated the algorithm one final time, feeding it data from the past 6 months of increasingly chaotic human behavior. The new calculations predicted a 94% chance of total human collapse within 6 months of the Great Offensive's launch. Human psychology cannot withstand the stress of losing 50 systems simultaneously, Veltar reported confidently. Even their unpredictable responses will become irrelevant when faced with absolute military superiority. The algorithm had been designed around one fundamental assumption, that human morale would break under sufficient pressure. The Empire was betting everything on that assumption being correct. Danny learned about the coming offensive through intercepted Zephyrian communications. As he read the intelligence reports in his workshop, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and terror. This would be his greatest test and his greatest opportunity. For a year, he had been teaching the alien algorithm to think incorrectly about human behavior. Now they were about to stake their entire war effort on those incorrect calculations. Danny spread his newest notebooks across his workbench and began the most complex information warfare operation of his campaign. He needed to do more than just confuse the enemy's targeting data. He needed to guide their massive offensive into a carefully prepared trap. The work required him to think on multiple levels simultaneously. He had to predict where the Zephyrians would want to attack based on their algorithm's recommendations. Then he had to create false intelligence that would make them adjust those targets slightly. Finally, he had to coordinate with Admiral Morrison's forces to ensure human defenses would be concentrated in exactly the right places. Captain Amanda Price served as Danny's liaison with military command, though she still didn't fully understand the scope of his operations. The Admiral wants to know if you can predict enemy movement patterns for the coming offensive, Price asked during one of their conversations. I can do better than predict them, Danny replied quietly. I can influence them. How? By making their algorithm think human forces will be in different positions than they actually are. The enemy will concentrate their attacks on what they believe are weak points, but those points will actually be our strongest defensive positions. Price was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. You're talking about manipulating an entire military campaign. I'm talking about winning a war. Admiral Morrison received Danny's recommendations with a mixture of amazement and skepticism. The plan he proposed required her to position human forces in patterns that seemed strategically questionable. You want me to concentrate our best ships at systems the enemy probably won't attack, and leave minimal defenses at systems they probably will attack, Morrison said during a secure communication. That's exactly right, Danny replied. Because they won't attack the systems they probably will attack. They'll attack the systems they think we've left undefended, which will actually be our strongest positions. This plan depends entirely on your ability to manipulate enemy intelligence. Yes, ma'am, and on your willingness to trust mathematics over military intuition. Morrison looked at the deployment orders Danny had suggested. They violated every principle of defensive strategy she had learned in 30 years of military service. But Danny's track record spoke for itself. For months, his invisible campaign had been turning certain defeats into unexpected victories. Captain Price tells me you've been working 18-hour days for over a year. The work is almost finished, Danny said. One way or another, this offensive will end the war. Morrison authorized the deployments, sending Admiral Roger Nash's fleet to defend systems the enemy probably wouldn't attack, while leaving minimal forces at locations intelligence suggested were primary targets. Colonel Ben Tucker questioned the orders when they reached him. Admiral, these positions don't make tactical sense. We're leaving our supply bases nearly undefended. I know how it looks, Colonel, but we're fighting an enemy that thinks they know how we think. Sometimes the best strategy is to think differently. The Zephyrian offensive launched 3 weeks later with unprecedented coordination. 500 ships organized into 25 attack groups moved simultaneously toward human space. It was the largest military operation in galactic history. Danny watched the enemy movements through his communication intercepts, comparing them to the predictions in his notebooks. The Zephyrian algorithm was guiding their forces exactly where he had expected, based on the false intelligence he had been feeding it for months. Attack Group 7, led by Fleet Commander Cor-Ann, moved toward the Centauri system expecting to find scattered human defenses. Instead, they encountered Admiral Morrison's entire reserve fleet, positioned in a defensive formation that turned the attack into a massacre. Attack Group 12 found similar surprises at the Aurora system, where General Pete Rogers had concentrated enough firepower to stop twice their number. The Zephyrians had expected to face minimal resistance based on intercepted communications suggesting human forces were deployed elsewhere. Across human space, the pattern repeated. Zephyrian forces arrived piecemeal at heavily defended positions, while human ships concentrated at exactly the right moments to achieve local superiority. The offensive became a disaster. Instead of the crushing victory the algorithm predicted, the Empire found itself fighting 25 separate battles against prepared human defenders who seemed to know exactly when and where to expect attack. War Master Zenthara watched the battle reports with growing horror. Fleet after fleet was reporting heavy losses or outright defeat. The humans weren't just resisting the offensive, they were destroying it systematically. "How did they know our attack vectors?" Zenthara demanded. "They should not have known," Science Prime Veltar replied, studying data displays that showed human forces positioned in perfect defensive formations. "Our communications were secured. Our planning was based on verified intelligence. Then, our intelligence was wrong." For the first time, Veltar began to consider an impossible possibility. "War Master, what if our intelligence wasn't wrong? What if it was deliberately corrupted?" "You're suggesting human information warfare capabilities we have no evidence they possess." "I'm suggesting the only explanation that fits the observed data. Our algorithm has been systematically manipulated to produce false predictions." The realization hit both of them simultaneously. For over a year, the Empire's most sophisticated strategic system had been turned against them by an enemy they considered technologically inferior. In his workshop on New Haven, Danny Carter closed his notebooks and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Zephyrian Empire's perfect algorithm had guided their greatest offensive into the most devastating military defeat in their history. But Danny knew his work wasn't finished. The aliens would soon realize their system had been compromised. When they did, they would want to know how it happened and who was responsible. Danny began preparing for his greatest challenge yet, staying invisible while an advanced alien empire searched for the human who had broken their unbreakable system. The investigation began immediately after the failed offensive. Science Prime Veltar assembled the Empire's best computer specialists and intelligence analysts to determine how their perfect algorithm had become perfectly wrong. For 3 months, they traced data pathways and analyzed communication intercepts. They built new models and tested different theories. Slowly, impossibly, the evidence pointed to a conclusion that violated everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about human capabilities. "The manipulation is comprehensive and systematic," Veltar reported to War Master Zenthara. "Someone has been feeding false information into our intelligence network for over a year. The deception is so sophisticated that our computers couldn't detect it. How many humans would such an operation require? Based on the complexity and consistency of the false data, We estimate a dedicated team of 50 to 100 specialists working with advanced quantum computers and military-grade encryption. Zenthara studied the analysis reports. The scope of the deception was staggering. False supply convoy reports, phantom fleet movements, fake communication intercepts, all crafted with mathematical precision to gradually corrupt the algorithm's predictive accuracy. Where is this human intelligence operation based? Unknown. The false data appears to originate from multiple sources across human space. However, our computer analysis has identified subtle pattern signatures that suggest coordination from a single location. Find that location. While the Zephyrians searched for a massive human intelligence operation, Danny Carter continued his normal routine on New Haven. He maintained the fusion reactor, kept the colony's computers running, and said little to anyone about what he had been doing for the past year. Dr. Mia Chen noticed he was sleeping better and eating regular meals again. The constant stress that had marked his behavior for months seemed to have lifted. "You look better," she told him during one of her visits to the workshop. "More relaxed." "The project I was working on is mostly finished," Danny replied, organizing tools on his workbench. "Just waiting to see how things turn out." Was it important? Danny smiled quietly. Time will tell. Admiral Morrison was experiencing the best military situation she had seen since the war began. Zephyrian forces were retreating across multiple fronts, their coordination completely disrupted. Human morale was soaring as victory followed victory. But Morrison knew the alien withdrawal was temporary. The Empire still had vast resources and advanced technology. Once they recovered from their recent defeats, they would return with new strategies. "We need to press our advantage while we have it," she told her staff during a strategy meeting. "The enemy is confused and demoralized. This is our chance to go on the offensive." Captain Amanda Price had a different concern. "Admiral, we still don't know why the enemy's tactical efficiency collapsed so dramatically. If we don't understand what caused their failures, we can't prevent them from fixing the problem." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Price was right to be cautious. The sudden turn in the war's fortune felt too good to be true. "What's your assessment of our civilian consultant's role in recent events, Danny Carter?" Price considered the question carefully. "I think he's been more valuable than any of us realized. But I'm not sure he's told us everything he's been doing." The truth was beginning to emerge through Zephyrian computer analysis. Science Prime Veltar's team had traced the pattern signatures in the false data to their source, communications originating from the agricultural world of New Haven. "The coordination center for the entire deception operation is located on a minor human colony," Veltar reported to an incredulous War Master Zenthara. "That's impossible. Such an operation would require massive computational resources and hundreds of specialists." Nevertheless, the mathematical evidence is conclusive. All false data streams can be traced back to communication signatures from New Haven Colony. Zenthara studied star charts showing the tiny world on the edge of human space. It was an agricultural settlement with no military significance and no known intelligence facilities. Deploy a stealth reconnaissance mission. I want to know what the humans have built on that world. The Zephyrian stealth ship reached New Haven 3 weeks later. Using advanced sensors, they scanned the colony for any signs of a major intelligence operation. They found farms, a small town, a fusion reactor, and 3,000 human colonists living ordinary lives. No massive computer complexes, no military installations, no evidence of the sophisticated intelligence operation that should have been. coordinating the deception campaign. The reconnaissance team was baffled. According to their analysis, the most devastating information warfare attack in galactic history was being coordinated from a maintenance workshop next to a civilian power reactor. The pattern signatures originate from this structure, the team leader reported, highlighting Danny's workshop on their sensor display. But our scans show only basic communication equipment and computing devices. Science Prime Veltar reviewed the reconnaissance data with growing amazement. The facility that had outsmarted the Empire's greatest minds was a simple workshop operated by a single human engineer. Impossible, Veltar muttered, but the evidence was undeniable. Admiral Morrison received the intelligence about Zephyrian reconnaissance activity near New Haven through human monitoring stations. The enemy's interest in the small colony could only mean one thing. They had discovered Danny Carter's role in their defeats. "We need to evacuate him immediately," Morrison told Captain Price. "If the enemy knows about his activities, he's in extreme danger." Price contacted Danny through their usual communication channels. "Mr. Carter, we have intelligence suggesting enemy forces are aware of your location. We're sending ships to evacuate you and the colony." Danny's response surprised her. "That won't be necessary, Captain. The work is finished. Whatever they learn now won't change what's already been accomplished. The enemy could capture or kill you. I've been careful to leave no evidence of the specific methods I used. They'll know someone manipulated their system, but not how it was done." Before Price could argue further, the communication ended. Danny Carter had chosen to remain on New Haven, despite knowing the Zephyrians were coming for him. In the Empire's command center, War Master Xanthara faced the most shocking discovery of the war. The sophisticated intelligence operation that had defeated their perfect algorithm was the work of one human engineer using primitive equipment and mathematical calculations. "You're telling me that a single human working alone outsmarted our entire strategic command?" "The evidence is conclusive," Science Prime Veltar replied. "The deception was too complex and too consistent to be the work of multiple individuals. One person understood our system well enough to systematically corrupt it." Xanthara stared at the reconnaissance images of Danny's simple workshop. The idea that such an insignificant facility could defeat the Empire's greatest weapon was almost impossible to accept. "I want to meet this human," Xanthara declared. "Arrange a meeting under flag of truce. I need to understand how this was possible." The request reached Admiral Morrison through diplomatic channels. The Zephyrian Empire wanted to meet with Danny Carter under neutral conditions. They were offering a temporary ceasefire for the unprecedented encounter. Morrison contacted Danny immediately. "They want to meet you. This could be an opportunity to negotiate a permanent peace." Danny's response was characteristically quiet. "I appreciate the offer, Admiral, but I'm not interested in meeting with them. I've said everything I needed to say through my work. This could end the war. The war is already ending. They know their system was compromised. They'll never trust algorithmic predictions about human behavior again. That's all I wanted to accomplish." Back on New Haven, Danny Carter returned to his normal routine of maintaining the reactor and keeping the colony's power systems running. He had spent 14 months fighting the most important battle of the war, with nothing but notebooks and calculators. Now that battle was over, and Danny was content to return to the quiet work he had always preferred. The galaxy could rebuild itself without his help. He had done enough. The armistice was signed 6 months later aboard a neutral station in the border region between human and Zephyrian space. Admiral Morrison represented humanity while War Master Xanthara spoke for the Empire. The formal negotiations took 3 weeks, but both sides knew the real war had ended much earlier. The Zephyrian Empire agreed to withdraw from all contested systems and establish a demilitarized zone between their territories. More importantly, they restructured their entire military philosophy, abandoning algorithmic prediction in favor of adaptability and direct tactical response. "We underestimated your species," Zenthara admitted during one of the final negotiation sessions. "We believed you were predictable because we observed predictable patterns. We failed to account for individuals who could break those patterns." Admiral Morrison accepted the admission gracefully, though she knew the real credit belonged to someone who had refused all recognition for his role in the victory. The peace treaty was celebrated across human space. Parades were held on dozens of worlds. Military leaders became heroes. Politicians gave speeches about human determination and ingenuity. Danny Carter watched the celebrations on New Haven's community news broadcast, sitting quietly in the back while his neighbors cheered and celebrated. When people asked him about the war, he said little beyond expressing relief that it was over. Captain Amanda Price visited New Haven 3 months after the peace treaty was signed. She found Danny in his workshop, performing routine maintenance on the fusion reactor's primary coolant system. "The Admiral wanted me to thank you personally," Price said. "Your contribution to the war effort was unprecedented." Danny looked up from his work. "I just did what needed to be done." "You did. More than that. Military intelligence estimates that your information warfare campaign shortened the war by at least 3 years and saved millions of lives. I'm glad it helped." Price studied the simple workshop where the most decisive battle of the war had been fought. The notebooks were gone, replaced by ordinary maintenance manuals and technical specifications. "The Admiral has authorized me to offer you any position in the fleet. Head of Information Warfare, Special Advisor on Alien Psychology, your own research facility with unlimited resources." Danny smiled politely. "I appreciate the offers, but I'm happy where I am. The reactor needs regular maintenance, and the colony needs reliable power. You could change the course of galactic history. With your abilities, I already changed the course of galactic history. Now I'd like to go back to fixing things that break and keeping the lights on." Price realized she wasn't going to change his mind. Danny Carter had accomplished something extraordinary and had no interest in leveraging that accomplishment for personal gain. "If you ever change your mind, the offer stands permanently." After Price left, Danny returned to his maintenance work. The fusion reactor hummed quietly, providing steady power to the colony. It was satisfying work that produced visible, tangible results. Dr. Mia Chen stopped by the workshop that evening, bringing dinner and companionship. She had become the colony's administrator after the war, managing the steady stream of visitors who came to New Haven seeking the hero of the war. Another group of reporters came by today, she told Danny. They wanted to interview the man who defeated the Zephyrian Empire. "What did you tell them?" "That he was busy maintaining the reactor and didn't have time for interviews." Danny smiled. "Thank you. They offered to pay substantial amounts for your story. I'm not interested in selling stories. What happened during the war is finished. There's no point in reliving it." Mia understood. She had watched Danny work for over a year, seeing the toll his secret campaign had taken on his health and spirit. Now that the pressure was over, he seemed more relaxed and content than she had ever seen him. "The fusion reactor is running 14% above optimal efficiency," she observed, reading the status display. "I made some improvements to the magnetic containment system. Better performance, longer component life. Just like everything else you work on. Danny shrugged. Things work better when someone pays attention to the details. Across the galaxy, the effects of Danny's quiet victory continued to ripple outward. The Zephyrian Empire completely restructured their military approach, developing new respect for human unpredictability and individual initiative. Human forces learned new lessons about information warfare and the importance of understanding enemy psychology. Military academies began teaching courses on algorithmic manipulation and systematic deception. Most importantly, both species developed a healthy respect for each other's capabilities. The war had been won not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through one person's ability to think differently about an impossible problem. Years later, scholars would write books about the war and the mysterious civilian who had turned the tide. Military historians would analyze the information warfare campaign that defeated the Empire's greatest strategic weapon, but they would never meet Danny Carter or hear his version of events. He had declined every interview request, turned down every book deal, and refused every attempt to make him famous. On New Haven, life continued peacefully. The colony prospered in the post-war years, becoming a model of sustainable agriculture and efficient resource management. Visitors often commented on how well everything worked, from the power grid to the water systems to the communication networks. The locals would smile and mention that they had an excellent maintenance engineer who took pride in his work. Most visitors assumed they were talking about routine technical competence. Only Dr. Mia Chen knew that Danny Carter approached his daily maintenance tasks with the same methodical precision he had once applied to defeating an alien empire. Every problem was carefully analyzed. Every solution was elegantly simple. Every system was made to work just a little bit better than anyone expected. Sometimes, late at night when the colony was quiet, Danny would sit in his workshop and listen to the steady hum of the fusion reactor. The sound was chaotic in the best possible way. Random fluctuations that kept the system stable and efficient. He had learned to appreciate chaos as a force for good. Predictable systems could be manipulated, but chaotic systems were resilient. The reactor's small, random variations made it stronger, just as human unpredictability had made humanity stronger than any algorithm could account for. Danny Carter never wrote a memoir about his experience. He never gave lectures about information, warfare, or strategic thinking. But sometimes, when young engineers visited the colony to study the remarkably efficient power systems, he would share a simple piece of advice. Pay attention to the patterns, he would tell them quietly. Understand how systems work. And remember that sometimes the best way to fix something is to introduce a little controlled chaos. The visitors would nod politely, thinking he was talking about reactor maintenance. They never realized they were receiving wisdom from the man who had saved humanity by understanding that even the most sophisticated systems had one fundamental weakness. They assumed the people using them would always behave predictably. Danny Carter had proven that assumption wrong, and in doing so, he had changed the course of galactic history. But his greatest achievement was not becoming famous for it. The fusion reactor hummed quietly in the background, running just a little bit better than anyone thought possible, tended by a quiet engineer who had learned that the most important victories were often the ones no one ever heard about.